Viewer discretion is advised. Chapter 2, Premonition, Part 2. Trevor didn't even remember falling asleep. As he attempted to get his bearings, he scanned the room. Round windows let plenty of light in as the reflections of sparkling ocean waters played artfully across the walls of the small cabin. Morning had come while he slept. He felt the hardwood floor beneath him with his hands as he turned his head to see Beck. She was on the bed, with the two little ones beside her. He smiled to himself. Of course, she got the bed. As he stood up, he completely lost his balance by the slight rocking of the boat and almost dove face first into the floor. At the last second, he caught himself and regained his balance, then quickly looked over at his sister, hoping he hadn't woken her. She was still sound asleep. In fact, all three of them were. Now, to address the loud knocking sounds coming from the sides of the boat. As he made his way down a long hallway, he started to hear recognizable voices. He finally came to a brightly lit room, which he quickly identified as the galley. In it sat Jack, Seth, and Paco. He knew Paco had his men somewhere on the boat, and figured they were busy somewhere navigating the large vessel. "You guys hear that?" he asked as he walked sleepily towards the three of them. "Don't worry, my friend. My men have everything under control. We are just hitting some rocky waters. Come, senor, join us." Paco seemed like he was enjoying his new company. This was a relief to Trevor. After seeing how Paco deals with disappointment, he wouldn't want to be on this man's errands list. As Trevor sat down next to Jack, he rubbed his shoulder. "How you holding up, Gramps?" "Wonderful, Tiger. I got plenty of rest in the car." "Thanks for that. Speaking of rest, how did you sleep?" Trevor thought of his dream. As an answer to his grandfather, he could talk about it. Perhaps open a dialogue and really dissect his obvious PTSD. Maybe together, they could all analyze it and get it out of his system. Finally, he let out his simple response. "Great, really well, thanks." Then again, he thought to himself, who needs therapy. Hey, that was really weird about Kent and his two friends last night, he said, referring to Ash and Samel. I thought they were on board with the Ecuador plan. We only met them a few days ago, Seth replied. Who knows what's in their heads? They probably just wanted to beef up their supplies and acquire a couple extra vehicles. Either way, they said they were going to settle down in Costa Rica for a while. Needed a break. Told me to come looking for them if we needed anything. Your friends and I were just talking about this character you plan to see. A character named Zul, Paco announced, changing the topic. Funny name for a man. Your notes reference a precise GPS location. Should be roughly a 12-hour drive once we reach shore. Still uneasy about having a mass-murdering gangster around his family and friends, while at the same time not wanting to upset said gangster, Trevor gave a polite response. Fantastic, he said, while awkwardly looking away. Noticing Trevor's unease around Paco, Seth then added to the conversation. I thought it would be a good idea for Paco to come along. This whole safe harbor theory has struck his curiosity. Plus, if things go sideways, it would be good to have him on our side. Paco laughed. Yes, my friend. My team and I are always up for a good adventure. Besides, we have some precious cargo we need to deliver in the area. A promise to an old friend. He is a strong ally of ours. In fact, nobody travels Ecuador without his knowledge. The locals there refer to him as the Chancellor, so it would be good for you to have us by your side. We can make our delivery and meet back up with you. Trevor didn't like feeling kept this way. Besides, this was not the original plan. Paco was simply giving them a lift down the shore, bypassing an almost impossible journey through the dense South American jungle. Seth had described Paco and his team to Trevor once before. He knew they were not saints, but was unaware it came anything close to the levels of insanity they'd encountered in the short time of knowing them. Beck would never go for this. Maybe he could change the subject, save the topic for when Beck was awake. She was always good to getting out of ridiculous situations like this. I'm sorry, where did the supplies get stored? I need to get some food in me. Nothing's really sinking in right now, you know? Paco looked at Seth, then back at Trevor. Of course, my amigo. Your supplies are down one level. Perhaps I go check on my men now. We should be arriving very soon. Please, make yourselves at home. Come, Jack, I give you tour of my new boat. Trevor gave Paco a smile as he left the galley. What was that all about? Seth spoke up as soon as Paco and Jack left the room. Trevor looked over at him. Seth, you never told me that guy was capable of doing the things he did back on that dock. What if it's us next time? What if we rub him the wrong way? Look, man, I know Paco is a strange guy, but these are strange times. Maybe it would be good to have someone like him around. Besides, he's an old family friend. He could never harm me or my friends, he said as he continued speaking while noticing Trevor's troubled expression going unchanged. Listen, I'm always gonna back you, brother. Whatever your decision. Just think it over, okay? Trevor nodded in agreement. Let's go get some food. The two stood up and made their way to the lower level. A door opened to a large dark room as ambient lights began flickering on. Trevor and Seth walked in to see all their supplies neatly shelved. They separated and began going through the coolers. Trevor felt like he was being watched. He caught a dark figure out of the corner of his eye. He immediately looked over, but nothing was there. He did, however, notice a large steel door. The door appeared to be hinged in such a way that it would open outwards. Outside the door was a long steel rod running along the width of the door near the center about shoulder height. On either side of the steel rod were locks. Wonder what that is. Trevor gestured toward the door. It was strange. Seth looked right at it but didn't say anything. It wasn't like he was being rude or ignoring Trevor. It was almost as if he heard Trevor, looked at the door, then completely forgot about it altogether. Trevor shook off the awkward exchange and continued rifling through his supplies. He opened a brown cardboard box he didn't recognize. It was their guns. Trevor looked over at Seth. He knew Seth put a lot of trust into Paco, and he didn't want to insult him. While he saw Seth busy with his head buried in one of the coolers looking for some breakfast, Trevor quickly tucked a small gun in his belt and immediately covered it with his shirt. "Bingo!" Seth shouted. Trevor looked over. Seth was holding 2 small packages of beef jerky, a modern-day delicacy. They both laughed, then turned off the lights and made their way back towards the upper decks of the ship. They both made small conversation as they climbed the staircase back to the middle floor. "I'm gonna go check on Beck and the kids. You good?" Seth nodded in response. "Of course. Meet you on deck." Trevor jokingly ripped his share of jerky from Seth's hands. "This is coming with me," he said with a smile as he began walking back towards the room he had woken up in. While casually making his way through a small corridor, he opened the package of jerky and began to scarf down the first few bites. Before coming to the room where Beck and the kids were sleeping in, he came across a closed door. He thought for a moment and gave the door a polite knock. No answer. He slowly opened the door to a lightly lit blue room. A slightly bad feeling struck him as he pulled out his gun. He crept in the rest of the way, and a look of pure excitement came over his face. A full bar? Jesus Christ! He took his time while inspecting the wonderful treasure trove he had just stumbled across. He noticed, sitting atop all the rest of the alcohol, on a glass shelf of its very own, a beautifully designed glass flask of aged 100% pure agave Patron tequila. He placed his gun on the bar nearest the bartender station to reach the glass goddess, which was now giving him a come-hither look. Without another thought, he placed the flask in his back pocket. "I'll find a use for you very soon," he said aloud to himself, half expecting a rebuttal from the glass treasure, knowing all too well it must be too good to be true. Then he turned to the door and made his prompt exit. He then continued on his way down the hall, but paused for a moment as a bad feeling of something awful took over his entire body and made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He felt as if he were forgetting something. A door or something. What was it? He slowly turned around, as if beckoned by his subconscious. Of course, that was it. The large, locked steel door. It was just a moment ago. How did it fade from his memory so quickly? He changed directions and began retracing his steps back toward the stairs. He began thinking to himself, what could be so important to a mass-murdering gangster that it be locked up so securely? If there was going to be any arrangement between his group and Palco's of any future endeavors, he needed to trust this man. If he were to trust this man, he needed to know what was locked behind that large steel door. His pace quickened as he began briskly walking back toward the stairs. As he made his way to the bottom of the steps, he put the jerky in his front pocket. Then slowly, he made his way a few feet down the hall and placed his hand on the latch to the door that led back to the supply room. The room was dark. Instead of turning the lights on right away, he let his eyes adjust. Enough light poured in from the hallway that he was able to see much of the room. While staying by the entrance of the room, he traced his previous steps from when he was with Seth by sight. As his eyes led him further and further into the room, he was barely able to make out the bottom shape of the steel door. This time, he noticed something standing in front of the door. He could barely make out the shape of feet, but nothing more. The light, that far in, really only covered the floor. Trevor's heart began increasing in its beating pattern. In a split second, the feet quickly moved towards Trevor with a seriousness about it as the entire figure was coming into view. Trevor's chest kept pounding as his mind scrambled for a solution. He could hear the sounds of the shadowy footsteps and even a hint of heavy breathing approaching him quickly. Both of his hands sprang into action as his mind commanded them to the battlefield. His right hand went for the light switch while simultaneously his left reached to block the incoming threat. The lights flooded the room. There was nothing. It was silent, and other than shelves and their supplies, it was simply empty. Nothing, no one. It just didn't make sense. Shaking off what felt like his mind playing tricks on him, he slowly approached the steel door. He could feel an unexplainable void surrounding the front of the door as he placed a hand on its cold steel exterior. He began to work out a game plan in his head. Trevor quickly began rifling through his supplies, opening and closing one cooler after another. Finally, payday. He reached into the cooler that was now open and pulled out a pair of bolt cutters. How many times these things have come in handy, there's no counting, he thought to himself. He went back to the door with the bolt cutters in hand and went to work. The first one snapped through the lock with no issues. The second one was at an odd angle because of the placement of the door and a shelving unit next to it. There was no moving the shelving unit. Everything was welded down to prevent things from toppling over at sea. After struggling with the lock for what seemed to be forever, it finally snapped free. He took off the first lock and then went for the second. That was when he heard voices coming down the stairs. Startled, he thought fast and replaced the lock in a way to appear unharmed. After that, he rigged the other lock to appear the same way. The footsteps were getting closer as the voices, which were in Spanish, were becoming louder. Done with the locks, he leapt across the room and turned the light switch off in a similar motion. A basketball player would perform a slam dunk. No time to close the door. It would be too obvious at this point. He shimmied between two shelving units and remained quiet. The voices immediately stopped for the obvious reason of suspicion. Two glows from separate flashlights began to scan the room. A couple times a light would pass right over Trevor, and then eventually it happened. The light shined directly on his face and the men both stared at him. He was busted. But then, to his utter astonishment, both their flashlights turned off. The two men then closed the door, and the conversation in Spanish continued while it slowly faded away as they could be heard going back up the stairs. Trevor let out a sigh while muttering the words, "What the hell?" Never mind that, he thought. He turned the lights back on and quickly went back to the door, took off both the locks, and swung the door open. The room was pitch dark as a heavy, foul odor poured out from within and greeted his sense of smell. He blindly felt around the surface of the closest interior wall of the darkened room for a few moments. Once he made contact with what felt to be a light switch, he flipped it on. The same feeling he had one floor over his head moments ago was once again taking over his body. A sense of weakness in his knees and nausea throughout his stomach made an intrusive entry into his being as he laid eyes on several lined up and stacked cages with humans in them. No one in the cages made a sound. Upon closer look, he noticed that all their lips had been surgically stitched closed. All of them seemed to be older, but not elderly. They sat, holding their knees to their chests, dominating the trifle expanse of their cells. They all had tubes coming out of their pale and pasty abdomens. The tubes seemed to do nothing, as they were capped at their ends. They were mostly naked, with garments covering their private areas. Each of them seemed sickly and weak, as none of them really took much notice of his presence. Rather, they were just sitting in their cages, numb to the world around them. Some would look over at him, but then simply just look away. He noticed on the ones he could see, due to how they were situated, there were devices implanted in their lower right legs. The devices had blue blinking lights. Trevor's nausea peaked as he spun around, doubled over, and threw up. He slammed the door shut, leaving the light on, leaned up against it, and slowly slid down to a crouched position. He began to shake as he remembered back to being under that desk when the bombs dropped. He didn't have time for this, he thought to himself. He couldn't just sit here, waiting to be discovered while trying to regain his plexus. He had to move quickly. If not for getting his group the hell out of here, or saving what's left of the poor souls behind him, then at least for not getting caught sitting against this door that he'd just broken into, possibly exposing Paco and his team to the evil that they were. Beck and the kids were all cracking up. Seth, Anne, and Eugene were all smiling as well, while shaking their heads. Jack was busy being the life of the party. Trevor stepped out of the bridge onto the open deck and squinted from the late morning sun. "What is it, Trevor? You look like you saw a ghost," his sister remarked as she softened her laughter. I'm just a little motion sick from the boat, I think." She looked at him like he just grew a second head right from his shoulders. He doesn't get motion sick, she thought to herself. He loved the sea. Jack stood from the table. "I'm going downstairs to use the little boy's room. Too much wine." Beck giggled and looked at Trevor. "Gramps is ridiculous. Dad jokes never get old." Trevor displayed a fleeting smile and quickly began to analyze his environment. He noticed two of Palco's men standing guard on either side of the front end of the yacht. Another was down the deck near the back of the boat. Where was Palco? Where was the fourth man? "Trevor!" a man shouted from behind him. Trevor turned around. He couldn't move too fast. He still felt like he was going to throw up. Palco stood there with a stern face. "Trevor, you've been a naughty boy." Trevor knew what was coming. He went to put his hand on his gun for a quicker draw in case it came to that. "Shit, my gun. I left it on the bar. Goddamn Patron," he thought to himself. Palco stepped forward slowly towards Trevor. He reached out and placed a sarcastic yet friendly hand on Trevor's shoulder. Trevor looked over at his own shoulder with Palco's hand on it. Somehow he was reminded of his first impression of Palco from the night before. Palco lowered his voice, but not enough for the others not to hear. His men gripped their guns tighter and approached the group on the deck as they monitored the dialogue their boss was having with the guest in question. "I know what you found, Trevor." Palco leaned forward. So, Trevor desperately tried reading Palco's eyes. How did you like it? Was this seriously happening? How did he like it? "I'm talking about the tequila you found." "Calm down, my friend. I like to tease only. Like I said, mi casa es su casa. I hope you enjoy the Patron." Everyone began to relax as the tension on the deck slowly dissipated. Palco's men shared glances and provided uneasy smiles to one another as they lightened their grips on their assault rifles. Just then, the fourth man appeared from below and approached Palco. He whispered in Palco's ear. Palco's facial expression instantly changed to a rage, yet to be seen by Trevor and his group. Trevor knew what the man had discovered below and was now reporting to his boss. "Hombres!" Palco yelled with a specific and angry hand gesture in the air. All four men raised their weapons and pointed them at the group. "Not so fast, Palco." Directly behind Palco stood a cunning grandfather holding Trevor's gun to the back of Palco's head. He had snuck up on him from within the stairwell shortly after the fourth man came up. Palco put his hands up. "Tell them to drop their weapon, senor." "Jack, my friend," that's unable to finish his sentence. Palco flinched at the sound of gunfire blasted in his ear. Palco watched in sheer disbelief as one of his men standing to his opposite, directly beyond the group, succumbed to the bullet hole in the dead center of his forehead. His bodyguard stumbled back before falling off the side of the boat, making a splashy finale and putting to rest any argument Paco thought he had. Paco would have been better off knowing that Jack served in the military for 30 years before retiring as a 5-star general. 5 amateur gangsters didn't have the old man fazed in the slightest. Jack proceeded to help Paco with a friendly piece of advice. Now, Paco, you have 3 men left. The odds of them killing all of us with me holding this gun, I give you, maybe 5 to 3. Now, the odds of me planting a bullet in your pretty little yacht with your brain matter wrapped around it before that bloodbath comes to an end. Now that, I give me a 1 to 1. Your call, senor. Guns down, cabrones. Paco knelt to his knees. Good job, Paco. Now you and your friends are going to sit tight while we figure out a plan. Tiger, your call. Trevor smiled while looking at the kneeling gangster. Later that day, you fucking pieces of shit. This isn't over. Paco screamed out the best he could. After all, screaming from a cramped little cage, locked in a small, dark room that smelled of feces and urine, wasn't exactly the best place to exercise one's lungs. Cabrones, do something. Get us the fuck out of here. On the shore, the fully intact team of now only 8 stood next to their supplies on the sandy beach of Ecuador. They took special interest in the fading sun as it began to say its final goodbyes while descending towards the infinite North Pacific horizon. They felt a sense of peace, filtered through a lens of what might await them within the dense jungles behind. They seemed to shake the dark thought as they took a moment to embrace the calm they felt as they watched the beautiful Ecuadorian sunset. Oh yeah, and also as they watched the yacht in front of them, a quarter mile out, sink into the sea.